my name is Robin Munson. I do the adult programming here at the library. We have a few things I'm going to go over first of what we have coming up. And on March 28th, we have a community read. If you're interested in that, I think I have an audiobook left. Otherwise, you can find it on Libby also. Otherwise, we don't have any more copies of the book, which is good. We've got a lot of people reading it. We are reading Broken America, Seeing, Understanding, and Ending U.S. Poverty. So this is a nonfiction book. It was from a grant that we got, the Library Transforming Communities, focus on rural libraries, and it's a ALA national grant that we got for it, and that's how we got our pantry out there and some other things that we're giving away as far as frozen food and stuff like that to the people of our community. So this book is going to talk about, we're going to talk about poverty. We're going to have a community conversation on that, and we're going to discuss what we can do, what we are doing now, and what we can do to make it even better than what we're doing. So that is March 28th at 6:30 p.m. If you haven't read the book, you can still come to the conversation. It's perfectly fine. So Take and Go kits became very popular during COVID. I was doing for adults 2 of them each month. I'm going to bring them back in April, where we're going to do a couple of them because they've become very popular, which is great. So in April, I'm going to do 2 more of these kits. The first one is we're going to do needle felting. I don't know if you've ever heard about that, but it's kind of sculpting little figures with wool. And so the kit will come with everything you need to make a little hedgehog. So we're going to needle felt hedgehogs. They will begin to be available April 4th. So call in on April 4th to reserve your kit. Otherwise, they go within 3 days. They go extremely fast, these kits. People love to take them home and do them. So, and have a little craft project that they can do with their kids, or with, some of them have had ladies' night out, and they'll take their craft projects and they'll do them together. So whatever you choose. We are going to be having movie night, and that is Monday, April 11th at 6:30 p.m. We're showing American Underdog, the Kurt Warner story. He is, or was, an NFL quarterback, a really great one who's done some wonderful things, but he had his start in Iowa, and people may not realize that, but he did have his college start in Iowa. So this is about his stories, his struggles to make it to the NFL. The other kit we have is for Earth Day. So the other kit is available April 18th, and you're gonna get a pine tree, a little seedling that you can plant in a planter, and you can have it in your home probably for a couple years before you have to plant it outside your home, because it's gonna be a very tall pine tree. But you can either give it away, donate it to some other place, or you can plant it in your yard. But that's what the April 18th kit is. It's called Forest Forever. So, and now let's get to our program that we have now. Today we have Rudolph Daniels. He received his PhD in Russian and Soviet Studies from the Pennsylvania State University in 1971. Since then, he has taught at colleges and universities in the United States and also in Germany. He has written numerous articles and 5 books. His book, Trains Across the Continent, A Complete History of U.S. and Canadian Railroads, was written at the request of the railroad industry and is considered the official account of the nation's railroads. Dr. Daniels was also a contributing editor of the most recent edition of the Professional Railway Atlas of the United States and script consultant for the recent public TV production of Orphan Trains. Dr. Daniels retired as Assistant Dean and Department Chair of Railroad Operations Technology at Western Iowa Tech Community College. He now concentrates on research and writing, as well as giving presentations like he's going to be giving to you guys tonight. I'd like to first say thank you to the Humanities of Iowa for making this possible for us to have Rudolph Daniels here. So, without further ado, here is She's Been Working on the Railroad with Rudolph Daniels.
All aboard! All aboard Milwaukee Road, train number 3 2 points west, leaving Union Station, Chicago. Train number 3, major station stops: Milwaukee, Madison, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Minneapolis, McGregor in Iowa, Mason City, Emmetsburg, Spencer, Hartley, Sanborn, Sheldon, Boyden, and Canton, South Dakota. Change of trains at Canton, South Dakota to points west and south. Change of trains at Canton. Coaches up front, dining car, special parlor car for the patrons of the Spencer Library. Parlor car features observation windows, snacks, and adult beverages. And of course our Pullmans and the famous Beaver Tail Milwaukee Road observation car at the end. All aboard, train number 3 to points west, leaving Union Station. All aboard. Let me ask here first, anyone here take the Milwaukee Road out of Spencer? No? You did?
Yeah, I think so. To Marathon, did you go to Marathon?
You get to Marathon, you get any place on the train, yeah. Back when, sure. Sure, very good. Anyone else have a train ride? No? Nobody?
Train ride or just on that line?
Well, any train ride now, okay? All right, okay, where? Where?
My son and I have been between Omaha and San Francisco 6 times.
Wow.
Amtrak.
Was that the California Zephyr?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the California Zephyr. It was Amtrak, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good
My
ride.
husband's a railroad person.
I spent 30 years with Southern Pacific, combined DNRGW, combined to the UP.
Okay, was that before the UP merger?
Now, I finished my last 4 years in the merger.
Oh boy, that was something else, wasn't it?
Yep.
Whoa. Yeah, ma'am, you had your hand?
I rode on Amtrak one time to Minneapolis, then out to Salem, Oregon, and then down the coast to California. To visit
Wow, yeah,
Caltrans.
hey, you did the Empire Builder and then
And
Caltrans.
then back
Yeah.
to, where is it, somewhere in southern Iowa where the train comes.
Preston.
Preston.
Correct. Okay, well
It's
then
been
you-
years ago.
Okay, then you came up back on the California Zephyr, that was a train.
I don't
she
remember
rode
the
on.
name of the train, but yeah, it's been
Yeah.
so many years ago.
Well, yeah.
But I have relatives in Oregon and in California, so we had stops there.
Okay, very good. Someone else? Yep.
Rock Island,
Sure.
from Sioux City to, I assume, to Fort Dodge or something.
It wouldn't have been Sioux
Carroll,
City.
Iowa.
Yeah, the Rock Island didn't go to Sioux City. But Fort Dodge, yes. Yeah, Fort Dodge was a Rock Island town. And you went to where?
Back then.
Hmm?
I'm sure it must have went through, or the train went through Galva anyway, when I was a kid. And then,
Yeah, the Rock Island went near
I
Galway,
wrote
yeah.
that, but I don't remember exactly where we went.
Okay, I think that line goes up to Esterville. That was the old line up to Esterville. Yeah, and then it went up into Minneapolis, it went up to Minnesota and over to South Dakota.
Whatever it was, if it wasn't the Rock Island, it was an east-west train.
Chicago Northwestern, probably. Probably. When you said Galva, it was more likely the Northwestern that went to Galva, yeah.
And then there was one that went through Storm Lake, east and west through.
Well, there were a couple through Storm Lake. Illinois Central was your big east-west through Storm Lake.
Yeah, Milwaukee went. Did it go through Sioux Rapids? Way back?
I don't know whether it was Sioux Rapids. I know the Milwaukee also went through Storm Lake too. Milwaukee, there was a line that went up to the
There
lakes.
was a Rock Island, there was one that went through Webb. There was 2 of them south of Webb, but one went this way and another train. I think this, because he came to Spencer and was one.
Okay.
So that might, Milwaukee?
Could have been.
Branch?
Could have been. Could have been. Okay, ma'am, you had one more?
Well, yeah, we rode the CP Christmas train a few years back, and then, of course, when I was little too, we, as a school field trip, we rode from Dickens to Ruthven on a train.
Yeah, school trips, there were a lot of
Yeah.
school trips that did that.
And then we rode, of course, the pleasure train up at Spirit Lake when it was up there.
Okay.
But there's an original trestle down in Sioux Rapids on a farm. They've saved it. The
Sure.
farm has saved it. It's really cool.
Well, the rest of you who have not ridden on a train are culturally deprived. So we've got to get you a culture here to ride on a train, okay? Today's topic is she's been working on the railroad, and of course that's a takeoff of the song. You know, I've been working on the railroad. You know, and don't worry, I'm not going to sing that for you, okay? That be all right? And the other thing is that I'm not wearing a mask, okay? Even though people tell me that I look a lot better in a mask, all right? And maybe one last thing, that is it okay if I take my hat off? Would that be all right? If the glare gets too much, you know, just raise your hand and I'll put the hat back on. How I'd like to proceed, quite simply, is a narrative and talk about the history of women working on the railroad, who have worked on the railroad, I should say, up to modern times, okay? So we'll see some names and hear some things that women have done in the railroad industry up to modern times. And then we're going to see some photos of a number of these women. Of course, some of them were before photographs became popular and so forth and whatnot. So at any rate, there are literally over 1,000 women working on the railroad today. And overwhelmingly, most are in administrative positions, various administration, from, if you will, from secretary to president of a railroad. And today, of course, there are a lot of opportunities for women to have positions working on the railroad. The first record of women working on the railroad was in the depots of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, which was the first real commercial railroad in the United States. They had women working from time to time in their depot areas. And here again, we're talking about 1830s, 1840s, way before photographs, and individual names have been lost to history. Some others worked in railroad restaurants. Right, there were restaurants in railroad depots in the past, and women worked in those depots. During the Civil War, seemingly there were more women working in depots. Of course, there was a draft of men in the Civil War in the North and whatnot. So we had women replacing men working in the depot or train station. One in particular was one of the first, was the New Haven Railroad on the East Coast. As the telegraph grew incredibly after the Civil War, that opened up a lot of careers for women as telegraphers. They were called, both men and women telegraphers were called ops, operators. They was called ops in short. And what happened here, mostly in the western states, Iowa west to California, it was very simple that young girls, were talking 11, 12, 13, 14, teenage, grew up around the railroad station. Their parents worked for the railroad. There was no compulsory education or compulsory schooling until just about World War I. So kids learned from their parents and other adults how to read or how to do math and all that. And of course, the children, both boys and girls, growing up in the depot, they were taught how to man the telegraph key. And it was very, very simple, because that key someone had to be at that key 24/7. And when their parents were away or the adults were away, then the kids would man the key. They were taught how to do that. Well, a lot of the young women, that's how they started, was learning how to operate the telegraph key in the depot. But by the 1880s, Western Union was establishing offices outside of the railroad stations in towns and cities, sometimes many offices in a city. And they paid more than the railroad. And a lot of these young women, young girls, would growing up, learn the trade of being ops, working telegraph at the railroad depot. And then when they got to be in their later teens or 20s, they would get a job working for Western Union in the city. And that to them was very advantageous. It paid more. You go where it pays more. It's simple. The other thing was, the office work was less grimy than working in the railroad depot or railroad station. So this all opened up careers, non-railroad careers for young women. One of the things, you had both men and women operator in the cities, and then a lot of the large businesses had their own telegraph key. The way they have computers and telephones today, they would have their own telegraph key in their office building, and of course, these young women would then, if they preferred, would be employed in an office in one of the large companies. And of course, this lasted on until the telephone. And in fact, there was even a school in eastern Iowa that trained young women. As these great careers opened, you had young girls who wanted to work telegraph key, but they were not associated with the railroad, so it was even a school for them. Two sisters became very famous. That is Fannie and Julia Wheeler out of Vinton, Iowa. And Julia became the more famous. She traveled from railroad station to railroad station. She had many jobs from Iowa on to California because she was so quick with the telegraph key and so forth. So she became very famous on her own. And it's kind of interesting, when I wanted to get a photo of Julia, I called the Vinton Historical Society, and they never heard of her. So that took care of that. Okay, never heard of her. And they said they were going to look for a photo or something about her. They couldn't find anything. And I said, well, her name is in some railroad histories. I said, maybe you can backtrack that or whatever sometime when you get a chance. A lot of women worked in and around the depots because railroad work still is, but back then was very, very dangerous. That tons of steel moving is unforgiving. You remember the commercial, "Don't you wish everything was made by Rubbermaid?" Well, that's not true of the railroad. Nothing on the railroad is Rubbermaid. It's steel, and it's moving. It's heavy and whatnot. In fact, it was an extremely dangerous job, so much so that railroaders in the 19th century could not get life insurance. So a lot of the widows and then daughters of railroad workers who were badly injured or killed in a railroad accident would often, the railroad company and the other employees would find a place for the mom and daughters to work around the station or depot, everything from taking messages to cleaning or whatever, to try to help the family out. Again, there were no insurances, and they couldn't get life insurance at the time. So this was also a place where women worked on the railroad. The first woman engineer was a young girl, and she's been lost in history. Supposedly her father worked for a narrow gauge asphalt railroad in Virginia, and she often traveled with her father. Father became ill, and they claimed that she ran the steam engine for a couple of miles. I cannot imagine her moving. The throttle on a steam engine is really something to move, and what they call a Johnson bar, which had to do with the drive wheels, really takes full strength to work that. I can't imagine 11 or 12-year-old doing that. But anyway, that's the claim, that she was the first. She's been lost in history. She married shortly after as a young teenager and went with her husband to Pennsylvania, and nothing's been heard of her since. The first woman president is Sarah Kidder Clark, and she inherited the railroad from her husband, who passed away. And it was the Nevada County Narrow Gauge Railroad. It was only about 21 miles long, but anyway, she managed the railroad for about 12 years. And they said that she was very good at keeping up with improvements on the railroad as needed. She was very good at being attentive to that. In 1913, however, she just got tired of the whole thing, sold it, and then opened up a couple of stores in San Francisco as a businesswoman, owning her own stores. But she's the first woman president of a railroad going back, I guess, 120 years. And then you have Mary Pennington. She did not work for the railroad company per se, but she made her contribution by improving the insulation on meat cars, because, you know, cattle cars were taken to the meat processing plant, they were slaughtered, and then the meat was taken to the large cities for dinners, you know. And the meat was kept cool because they put ice in the cars. And they were already insulated, but she helped improve with the insulation to help that industry. One of the really big ones, and I'm sure that some of you heard the name of Judy Garland. Yeah, Judy Garland starred in a movie called The Harvey Girls. By the way, I had the surprise to have an interview with her cousin who lived in Sioux City, Iowa. And it was just amazing. She was talking about her cousin Judy, and one was Judy Garland. So it was kind of interesting. Anyway, the Harvey Girls, the movie Harvey Girls kind of shows a little bit of what they did. A guy by the name of Fred Harvey opened up these restaurants along the Santa Fe Railroad from Chicago to California. And there were actually 47 such restaurants. And they wanted to employ young girls to work as waitresses in these restaurants because they wanted these wholesome young women to be in contrast to the painted ladies that dwelled the saloons. So these Harvey Girls were supposed to be wholesome young women, and they had a dormitory, they had a uniform. We're going to see some of this in a photo. And they had to get Fred Harvey's permission to marry in their first 2 years of work. And literally hundreds of them got Fred Harvey's permission. And how they did it was they said that they would name their first son either Fred or Harvey. So in the route of the Santa Fe, you'll a lot of Freds and Harvey young boys being born in that area in the 19th century. But at any rate, thousands of young women worked in these Harvey restaurants. They were famous for their service and great dinners. Absolutely great dinners. In fact, the Harvey restaurant chef was the highest paid person in any of the towns in which the restaurants served. Along with that, you have Mary Colter, who, associated with Fred Harvey, had the idea that as the trains went west, people stopped at these restaurants, and why not have local Native American tribes come and sell items at the restaurant to tourists? And that was an idea of Mary Colter to the Santa Fe Railroad. And then the Santa Fe expanded that around the turn of the century and then following World War I, that they began to have tours, not just the Native Americans to sell items, but they could tour the reservation, stay at the Fred Harvey Hotel, and go in and have tours of these reservations. And started a whole new industry. But again, this began with Mary Colter. Mary Colter also is famous for being the designer of the silverware on the Santa Fe Super Chief train, which was one of the most luxurious trains in the world at the time. Well, not to be outdone, Iowa has Kate Shelley. Name ring a bell? No? Well, yeah, Kate Shelley. Yeah, okay, Kate Shelley. Kate Shelley, a young woman, a teenage girl. This is around 1900. Heard of how the legend goes is she heard of a train switch engine that crashed into Honey Creek nearby her house, and she knew the express was coming, so she quickly ran and crossed the trestle to the Moingona Depot to have them flag down and save the express from plunging into the creek. Well, historians later found out that with the switch engine on the same track, et cetera, that the train would have had to stop anyway. But anyway, she is known as Iowa's railroad hero. They've named streets and cities had water fountains named after Kate Shelley and whatnot. the Chicago Northwestern was so happy about Kate Shelley that they hired her as the depot station master in Moingona. And you can go to Moingona and actually you can see the remains of the depot, and I'll show you a photograph of it. I was talking with some of the people at the Boone and Scenic Valley Railroad before COVID. Remember, everything's before COVID and after COVID, right? Yeah, this was before COVID, and they were talking about someone really has to have the upkeep of that because it was let go. So at any rate, now it's after COVID. I don't know what's going to happen, but we'll have a photo or two of Kate Shelley and whatnot. She did not live long. In 1913, she died of consumption, and at that time they used consumption to describe tuberculosis or in some cases lung cancer or cancer and whatnot. World War I was really the first time that you have really women in an organized way, nationally working on the railroad. And I want to warn you, I've written the history of American railroads in World War I, so if you ask me a question about this, we'll be here all night. But try to be brief. What happened here was that as the men were drafted into the Army in 1917, World War I, they tried different ways to have them replace the men working on the railroad. But the federal government stepped in, and a lady by the name of Pauline Goldmark was to head the industry of women working in the railroad industry, particularly for protection. In other words, the federal government came in and said, yeah, we'll have women working on the railroad, but they are to be protected from injury. Remember, we said railroads were dangerous industry. They were protected from working in dangerous areas or in dangerous doings, in other words, dangerous jobs, and also not to work at night. They felt that it was unsafe for women to work at night. And women did join and did work on the railroad in various capacities, working in stations and so forth. But it was not a career thing. It was more of patriotism. There was a huge patriotic movement headed by a man by the name of Creel, and everybody, backing the war effort. And so the women did go and seek jobs in the railroad because of the patriotism and supporting the war effort. And as soon as the armistice was declared, within weeks, many of these women simply resigned. It honestly was dirty, grimy work, railroad work, dirty, grimy, greasy, around particularly the steam engines at the time. So it was more of an idea of helping the country during war rather than careers. After that, you did have, by the way, women could not work on trains. That was considered too dangerous. And this was all federal law. This was not railroads or unions. This was all federal law at the time. But after the war, the railroads did have special careers for women as hostesses and nurses on trains. Your great trains of the 20s, 30s, and just up to World War I often had hostesses with different titles and so forth. For example, the Northern Pacific had what they called the junior stewardess nurses. These young women had RNs. They were registered nurses working on these trains. The Santa Fe had also nurses, and they would even do babysitting. Union Pacific had what they called nurse hostesses. The Burlington had what they called Zephyrettes because their trains were called Zephyrs. The different Zephyr, California Zephyr, I think you said you travel, that's where it came from, the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. And they had these Zephyrettes working on the train. They even have, a lot of these Zephyrettes were secretaries for the businessmen to dictate letters, type letters, send telegrams, and so forth. So they worked as hostesses. The Pennsylvania had nurse hostesses. The Pennsylvania had really something great because they even had a nurse as a babysitter when mom and dad wanted to be alone and away from the munchkin for a couple of hours. Let the munchkin with the nurse, babysitter. By the way, that was all in the ticket of the price of the ticket. You didn't have to pay extra for this. So at any rate, industry-wide, it was supposed to be a woman, RN, to be of average height and build, and this is in quotes, pleasing personality, well-groomed, and well-behaved. That was in the industry for these women. But these careers were great. Can you imagine in the Depression when men working were getting $6 a day, these women made $125 a month, stayed at the best hotels, and even had an expense account at local stores, as well as having their clothing furnished by the railroad. So this was just a great job for a young woman traveling on wherever that, the route of that railroad, travel. And besides that, when you work for the railroad, you can get a pass. And then you could travel on other railroads after so many years. You had railroad pass. So they were truly working on the railroad. They had passes. It was really a wonderful career and very high. At that time during the Depression, that was extremely high wages. Now, this ended with World War II because the military, the services needed nurses, and it was very attractive for these young women to join the military because they would go in immediately as an officer. They would not go in as non-commissioned. They would go in as commissioned officer, second lieutenant, or Navy JG, Lieutenant JG. So this was very attractive for women. And the railroads in cooperation said, okay, our nurses are going to now, the younger women are now going to work as nurses. They did keep on the older, more mature women to work in their depot in the larger cities, and we're going to see that. A lot of the railroads kept because of soldiers traveling, the incredible traveling at the time, and people being injured, people needing attention, medical attention, in one way or another. So Pearl Harbor in World War II, really changed that picture. And with that, of course, now you're going to have women working on the railroad jobs where the men were drafted. And I want to explain that the draft was special on the railroads. A railroad man could not even volunteer for the service during World War II. What happened was, as with doctors and dentists, there's a special draft for railroad workers. And what the government did is, as the government was building up its own railroads throughout Europe and some of the islands in the Pacific, they operated railroads. They actually had the railroad men. So they would go to a railroad, they would go to Milwaukee Road and say, we need 3 engineers, 4 conductors, 10 brakemen, and 6 Gandhi dancers, people to repair track. And then the railroad would then ask the men who wants to go in the military. They were given just basic training of who to salute, railroad etiquette, military etiquette and whatnot, and then they were given railroad jobs, whatever they went in to do. They had a railroad job, working for mostly the Army. It was mostly Army that used them. The Navy did have some railroads in their ports, but it was mostly an Army. So there opened up positions for women as these men were drafted. In fact, the first railroad to be drafted was the Southern Pacific, to receive the first draft call, the men of the Southern Pacific. And then after that, all the railroads of the nation got the call for a draft. No railroad was left out. They were all as needed. They did employ some Mexicans at the time. They brought back retired railroad workers, came back again, patriotic duty. Pearl Harbor happened. We were at war. And retired, and then women came in. And women at this time were permitted to do a few things in the shops and in the railroad yards. Not much, because again, this was the most dangerous work, and lifting, heavy lifting of steel and whatnot were in the shops, and working in the yards where accidents did happen and whatnot. The Pennsylvania Railroad was one railroad that did hire women as conductors on passenger trains. and that was commuter trains whereby women did not have to stay overnight someplace. In other words, that was a big thing, that women did not have to stay overnight. They had special working conditions, special hours that they worked, again, and for their protection. This was all, again, federal law, federally mandated. The women during World War II were permitted to join the unions. Again, when the war ended, some of the women, particularly those who worked in the depot, stayed on. Very few stayed on working, doing the grimy work, and the work was really grimy and dirty and whatnot. And they preferred you'd have young women, preferably unmarried, or women whose children were already grown. There were restrictions on if a woman had children under 14, 15 years old. And also, too, particularly in the rail yards, the high schools would often let the boys 15, 16 and older to go and work in the rail yards, throwing switches and so forth, to relieve the railroad men of doing that work. Of course, the young boys, when they became 18, they were eligible for the draft into one of the branches of the military. Following World War II, again, some of these women stayed on, particularly the depot work, and some others had careers, again, as social engineering to make conditions better, designing designs of trains and accommodations and so forth. But your real change came about for equal opportunity employer in the 1970s. And that's when women and minorities began to apply for work on the railroad. And this became a point because this was at a time when the railroad industry was really going down quickly, late 60s and 70s. They were laying off workers, and now as they were laying workers off, they were hiring women and minorities. And this led to a number of very, very expensive lawsuits that the railroad companies had to pay, along with, as I said, dwindling business. They were losing track, abandoning track, and so forth. But this was the beginning of a new stage of careers for women in the railroad, where women would work on as conductors, would work as mostly engineers, did learn different skills or admitted to learn different skills, were union, as during World War II, were permitted to join the union and so forth. And many of these women then distinguished themselves in railroads, particularly in administrative work. They tend to go more into administrative or supervisory work rather than doing track work or working directly on the train. So that even today, there are two women who are railroad presidents of the Ontario Northern in Canada, and here in the United States, Bnsf has a woman president, Katie Farmer, that we could talk about. Okay, so there are a lot of careers for women. I know when I was in charge of conductor training, three of the young women that were in my classes became engineers with Union Pacific and Bnsf. I don't know where they are today, but railroad careers today do pay very, very well on different levels. The only problem, though, in certain segments, particularly conductor and engineer, that when there's no work that people can be furloughed, if you will. In other words, you're out of work for a period of time and then called back as the industry needs that. Okay. This is a portrait of Sarah Kidder Clark, which of course this is a posed photo, obviously, professional photo. She's the first president of a railroad in the United States, out in California for about 10 years, and then she went into other businesses. Okay, and this is Mary Pennington, and she's the lady who improved insulation on the meat cars and whatnot. There's a portrait of her, again, towards the end of the 19th century. And this is Katie Farmer. She's president of Bnsf. Her biography says that she held many positions at Bnsf. In fact, she started as an intern from Texas Christian University. They didn't say what she interned in. Her bio was fairly glib about that, and also what she held. The previous president, Carl Ice, his name was, personally groomed her to be the next president. In other words, she was designated to be his successor. And as you know, BNSF is part of the Warren Buffett, all of that enterprises and whatnot. They call him the Oracle of Omaha. I'm very proud to say that in Omaha, Warren Buffett and I have the same doctor. So I don't know if that means anything. Of course, he has a lot more money than I do, just a little bit. But anyway, Katie Farmer, the BNSF people say now they are farming, and before that they were working for the Iceman, for Carlite, working for the Iceman, and before that they had a president by the name of Mink, and they said we're working on the mink farm. So I don't know what they're doing. So they're farming again, I guess, at BNSF, Katie Farmer. Okay, this is Harvey Girls, actual picture. This is from Kansas Archives. The Harvey Girls, and you can see they wore a uniform and whatnot. These restaurants were incredible. If you got off the train and you ordered orange juice, they squeezed the orange in your glass in front of you. And the coffee urn was in the middle here. That coffee had to be drained and cleaned, and new coffee every hour. No still coffee at a Harvey house, huh? And they were tipped well. They really enjoyed their work. And as you could see, they were very wholesome and not the painted ladies at the saloon. See, that was very important. Okay, and this is, we have Mary Colter. Remember, she's the one who, oh my goodness, she's another, it slips my mind right now. Anyone remember? We'll come back to Mary Colter, okay? We'll come back to her. This is actually a picture of Kate Shelley, and this is the Moingona Depot as it appeared around 1900. Okay, here she is as a young woman, okay, in Moingona. The tracks of Chicago Northwestern is now Union Pacific, and they are no longer near, this is no longer tracks of that track has been abandoned, okay, and whatnot. So we'll have the next photo. This is the site today. This is my own photo. As I said, talking with people at Boone and Scenic Valley to try to make this an state historical site. I would suggest you go to Moingona. It's not a town anymore. It's just a little settlement of about 15 houses. That's all, just the 15 houses. Back over here is like a picnic area, and there's a creek, and there's a little trestle over the creek and whatnot, paths that you could walk and whatnot. I really think it'd be great to have this as an historic site in honor of Kate Shelley. Of course, the depot was changed. That picture was taken from like down here, looking up to, there was a door on this side, which is now, there's no longer steps going up to it and whatnot. So that's as it appears today. It's really not in too good shape. It really needs to have work done on it. But if you're ever on Highway 30 and you get near the Des Moines, it's just near the Des Moines River, and there's a sign, Kate Shelley, Park. You can go up there and see it if you want. Okay, this is Pauline Goldmark. She was the highest official woman in the Woodrow Wilson cabinet during World War I. Official position. She was not a cabinet member, but she did sit with them, and she was in charge of the women working on the railroad. The railroad industry was so critical to the nation in World War I, and in my book I show it was the railroads that won World War I, along with General Pershing's tactics, okay? So she was the lady who was in charge of women working in the railroads. And this is from World War I. This is a posed photo. As I said, women were not permitted to work in shops, and these, with their hammers, they look like they would be working in a shop someplace. This is a posed photo. This is from National Archives. So this is public domain photo. And I said after World War I, you could see where they talk about the women taking care of children, taking care of people, the hospitality. This is Northern Pacific Railroad. This is an advertisement for them during interwar period. This is from the Pennsylvania Railroad, nurse taking care of children. I said built-in babysitters on the train and whatnot. And this lady was in charge of women's services on the Baltimore and Ohio. The Baltimore and Ohio did a series of advertisements saying how they were the best railroad for women to travel. And even the engineers let the steam out of the boiler slowly and silently, not to disturb women. How true that is another question. But this lady was in charge of that, making comfortable travel for women going between New York and Chicago. Baltimore and Chicago, and Baltimore and New York City. Because they were major competitors with the Pennsylvania Railroad in both areas in New York Central, between New York and Chicago. And again, this is a Zephyrette. You see the map here, Burlington route, everywhere west, map of the West, and that's a Zephyrette in her uniform. This is of the 1930s. The next one will show. This is the Zephyrette in on a Zephyr train. And this is they had like a lounge car at the end of the train, and in there they had the Zephyr secretary, if you will, for businessmen. They would go to the lounge car and dictate their letters or business to the train secretary, the Zephyrette, who was the secretary. Other Zephyrettes took care of the passengers. They claimed 3 pillows with every seat. So for your head, 3 pillows and whatnot. The Zephyrette would take care of you. They were nurses. They were just fantastic advertisement, for travel. I want to mention, very quickly, I did a program in Burlington, Iowa, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, right? And I stayed at the Super 8 Motel there. And I always ask, where's the best place to get something to eat? And they said, well, 1 block across the street, you go down a block, is our casino, and they've got the best restaurant. Well, I'm not a gambler. I got nothing against gambling, but I am not a gambler. But I went there, and I walked in, and the first room was a twice life-size mural of this car on the wall of their restaurant. And it went around a corner. It was like double life size, as someone actually painted. And I said, wow, hey, this is great. And the waitress said to me, what do you mean? I said, the painting, the mural. And she said, yeah, what is it? Nobody here knows what it is. I explained to her, it's kind of a Zephyr car. It shows you how much things have changed, huh? Yeah. Of course, I'm there munching and I'm watching the Zephyr car. I enjoyed it. And by the way, there was a Zephyrette in there too. Yeah. Okay, you can see here, President Roosevelt, World War II again. Again, not that careers, it's patriotic duty. A lot of these women had their husbands in service, brothers in service, children drafted in the Army and whatnot. And this is how they were to make their contribution. And I always find this interesting because this is World War II, and this is a portrait of Franklin Roosevelt in the early 1930s, much younger than he did look in World War II. But you can see here they had the name, the woman's name and whatnot, and working in various ways in the railroad. And we'll have other pictures I'll explain in a moment. Again, a color poster. Women are needed also, as women will work sooner. We will win the war. Okay, going back to the theme of women power, I'd like to show that this is a color. She's working on an airplane carapace here. And by the way, that's how Marilyn Monroe got discovered. Her photo was taken working on a bomber carapace by a World War II photographer. And that's how Marilyn Monroe became famous. So I guess she's becoming famous too. Santa Fe, women at work. These ads with the various railroads with women at work, there are a number of them during the war, are usually quite small, maybe a quarter page or whatnot. As the Santa Fe ad was almost like a cutout of a smaller magazine, Santa Fe lines. There were all kinds of patriotic things with the railroads and locomotive companies during the war. This is one of my favorites. This is a legend of Molly Pitcher, battle in Pennsylvania. This is the Pennsylvania Railroad with this. The Pennsylvania Railroad had the best advertisements during the war. They had two great ones. This is one of them. Full-page ads in Life magazine. Cost them a fortune. Molly Pitcher, supposedly her husband was injured shooting a cannon during the Revolutionary War, and she was bringing water to the men shooting the cannon, and when her husband got hurt, she shot the cannon. It is a legend and whatnot, but here they're using the legend of Molly Pitcher again. Her husband is off to war, and what is she doing? She's pitching in, she's doing her part working on the railroad. Down here, and you really can't see it here that well in the picture, the Pennsylvania Railroad listed the number of their men who were drafted as railroaders into the service and how many were killed. Because the trains in World War II were brought right up to the battlefront in Europe. At this point, the Pennsylvania Railroad, again, you can't see this well, but at this point, they had over 20,000 of their men drafted into the Army and over 120 killed in action. So just because they were working on the railroad in Europe or in the Pacific did not mean that they were not going to be subject to being shot or being killed in one way or the other. So it's Molly Pitcher for the Pennsylvania Railroad. This is also a Pennsylvania Railroad photo because it owned a subsidiary of Long Island Railroad. These women doing various things on the railroad. You can see the steam engine here, and also the Long Island use electricity on their railroads. These are women, various capacities working on the railroad. We're going to see a number of these. This is Union Pacific. Union Pacific had these two nurses they had a hospital room at Omaha to take care of travelers during the war. And these are two nurses. If you were injured, got hurt, got scratched, whatever, you can go to them for aid at the various stations. And this is, I'm grateful to Brenda Mainwaring for these photos. It's another story. These Union Pacific photos, I called their museum in Council Bluffs, and they said, oh, no, we're not letting out any photos. I did some work with Brenda Mainwaring, who's now vice president of the railroad. I said, Brenda, I got a problem. I'm trying to get some photos, show women working on the railroad. I said, I won't get them from Union Pacific. And she said, hang up, and you'll get a phone call in 10 minutes. 5 minutes, I got a phone call from their museum director. What photos do you want? So I said, okay, send me the photos. So I got the photos. So this is one of them. There's a couple of more of women working on the railroad. Again, World War II. There's no explanation of this occasion, but this was a women working in an area that there was a special celebration with the executives, with women climbing on a locomotive, and just a couple of more of these during the war. One is going to be in color. They had to clean the windows of the cabooses, and that's important because the conductor in a freight had to look over the train to look for if a bearing was going bad on one of the cars. And so they had to have clear vision out of their windows to see that. And we're going to explain that more in a moment. Okay. Here's a woman ops, a telegrapher. Now, the telegraph was used on into the 1950s on some railroads. But Union Pacific in the cities went to a electric typewriter on tape. In 1936 was the last ops operator at a Union Pacific station in the city. That is their offices in the city. But the railroad still used telegraph, and you could see the telephone here. And she was working during this is a World War II photo. There's a couple of more. This is the same lady, actually. These hoops were to hold up train orders as the train went by to tell the engineer what track ahead, whether to stop, slow speed, or anything special. They would hold up the order on that hoop, if you will, to the engineer and then later to the conductor on the caboose. And here she had to clean the locomotive number so that that locomotive number could be seen clearly at switch towers. You had to be able to know what train was going through, what freight was going through, the many freights during World War II, and they would trace them by the locomotive number. That number went with what freight or what main, which was a military troop train. So they had to make sure that that number was visible at all times on the steam locomotives. These are, again, all Union Pacific photos taken over. This is Chicago Northwestern. Again, these ladies were known as wipes, wiping down, getting the grease off the loco. Said this was a dirty, grimy job. The men usually did this work before the war. And here, they're pitching in, they're Molly pitchers. They're Molly pitchers. Okay. This is unique. I got this for my Trains Across the Continent book. These are 4 Native American Gandhi dancers, meaning that they're track repairs. During World War II, these ladies, Native Americans of Alaskan tribes, volunteered to work as a track gang on the Alaska Railroad. And when I got this photo from the Alaska Museum, and they said, well, could you please mention their name in your book, because I told them what my project was. So I make sure that I mention their names here from the Anchorage, Alaska Museum. So there you have actual Gandhi dancers. Women did not normally do this type of track gang work. This was very heavy. You could see her lifting the sledgehammer, the maul to hit the spikes on the track. This was very heavy, demanding work. But these women volunteered to do it. They wanted to do their part, to help the Native. And of course, the Japanese, as you know, invaded Alaska. They actually were entrenched in Alaska to the end of the war. So Alaska was really under siege. Okay. This is again from Brenda Mainwaring, and this is a station master, lady station master on the Chicago Northwestern out of Ames, Iowa. She's out of Ames, Iowa, showing the uniform that they wore. And these are 2 women working, again, Union Pacific, cleaning the locomotives and whatnot. You can see the grime and whatnot on their clothing. Not the most glamorous of jobs. Got a couple of more here. And here's another one. They never saw what she was doing. She was not an engineer, I know that. She could not be an engineer or a fireman. I don't know whether, but she's just a posed picture on the train. Here, they're working a turntable. You can see here in the back, there's the roundhouse where steam locomotives were kept for servicing. And this particular turntable was electric. So she was in charge, the lady here was in charge of electric controls to move that turntable to get the locomotives in and out of the roundhouse. This lady here is one of our brake people. We're going to see her again very shortly. Okay. Here again, I put this here. I had to include this for women only. Others keep out. Okay, we're going to have some privacy during working on the railroad in World War II. Again, you can see the grime. Here she is, that one lady who was on that turntable, and she's here carrying a wool cloth, and her job was to inspect and maintain brakes, because your brakes, your bearings. The bearings at this time on your freight and many passenger cars were simply a large round bearing, and it was in oil, and then they packed this wool packing around that bearing. And that's because if that bearing was going bad, it would get hot. And the wool would get hot and start to smolder and emit an absolutely incredible ugly odor and emit a kind of like a bluish gray smoke from that, what they called hot box. They called it a hot box. And that's where the conductor in the caboose would give the signal to stop the train, because you don't want that bearing to get so hot that it breaks, and that's when you have a derailment. So that was a very important job. Her job was to go around to check the wheels when the trains would come into stop in an area, depot and all that, freight,
check the wheels, see if they're hot. They actually had like a crayon they would put to the wheel to see how hot it was. It could be a little hot, okay, but if it's very hot, then that car was bad ordered to have to be taken out because the bearing was going bad. Now today, they have roller bearings on the cars. It's less likely, but still derailments happen due to bad bearings. But her job was important. She has her packing, her wool packing here, and she had to make sure there was oil in that bearing hot box. Today, by the way, they actually have electronic hot box detectors on the track that will tell the railroad, that there's a car on that track that has a bad bearing. You have to stop the train for such a length of time. In fact, I was on a train one time. We had to stop because of a hot box. A lot of times you have false alarms too, and we believed that ours was a false alarm. But at any rate, she had a very important job during the war. I included this, 2 wipes, again, to go and clean the locomotive, the grease, accumulating dirt and whatnot. I include this because this is a very rare color photograph during World War II. Well, a lot of black and white photos, but not color. Okay. Here's again a posed photo. This is again from the Union Pacific Museum, but this is actually a Burlington switch locomotive, diesel locomotive during the war. It doesn't say what she was doing, but that's a Burlington lines. So it serves all the West, and that was the Burlington slogan. But that's from the Union Pacific Museum. And here again, Union Pacific Museum, she's getting the grease and grime and dirt off the drive wheel mechanisms here. Very important. Oh, Miss Draper, Dorothy Draper. After the war, wait till you hear this. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad had this resort called Greenbrier. Huge resort. It was a hotel of 600 rooms. And it was used as a hospital during World War II, a veterans hospital during World War II. But after World War II, they hired Dorothy Draper to renew it as a resort. So she was in charge. Now understand, this is 1946, of a $9.8 million project. She was the director, Dorothy Draper. Get this, I love this to give you these ideas. 600 guest rooms, 30 miles of carpeting she bought. 30 miles of carpeting, 40,000 gallons of paint, 15,000 rolls of wallpaper, and 34,000 items of furniture that she was totally in charge of for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railroad. They never opened the resort and the trains because the railroad industry started declining by 48, 49. See, so they weren't going to make any money out of this. So the federal government bought it. And now it's the place where Congress and the cabinet and officials in Washington to go should Washington, D.C. be bombed. They can go there. They have food there in supply for Congress for something like 5 years for all of them. It's just a tremendous resort. But you can go there today, and you can get a room at the Greenbrier today if you want. It's in beautiful countryside. Just fantastic. Dorothy Draper. I love it. She bought drapes for the Greenbrier, and she's Dorothy Draper. Sorry. Okay, Union Pacific photo, again, in the late 60s, 70s, to employ women in various positions. Here, lady working an early type of computer card gizmo. Of course, you can see the Union Pacific. They made sure this photo was taken with Union Pacific. I bet you did. Okay, and I'll show you what they had to do, too. Go ahead. This is from Sioux City. George Lindblade let me have his photos. This is the early 70s. This is Bnsf. At that time was Burlington Northern. She's walking the cars. It's called walking the cars. It's usually a first job on the railroad where she's checking the numbers on the freight cars. Because if the train... It's
called a mud hop.
Right. And she had to make sure what cars go where, all the cars were in line and so forth. That's the first job. We got a close-up of her. I don't know where she is today. That's a close-up of her. See, she's got her pad and she's checking her cars. One of the first women working in these positions, at least this is in Sioux City. Of course, you see the Burlington, George had to get the Burlington in there in the photo. Okay, this is Union Pacific. The next three are engineers out of North Platte, Nebraska. Okay, yeah, out of North Platte again. And this young lady's working in a switch locomotive. Looks like a SW-1200, wouldn't you say? Probably, it looks like an SW-1200, the interior. That's one of the larger switch locomotives, okay? This lady's in Oregon, and she's working what they call CTC, Central Traffic Control, where you can maintain, where your trains are on a track to optimize track usage for your train. So she's working the traffic control. Okay. We're going now to a number of the women who are working, if you will, in administrative positions. This is Grace Haddon, Union Pacific. She's in charge of noise and vibration control for Union Pacific and what they call Progress Rail that makes locomotives. So she's in charge of that division. Okay. This is Deborah Chin, and she's executive director in charge of Central Traffic Control for the Long Island Railroad, which is now an independent commuter line out of New York City onto Long Island. Deborah Chin. So you see these women are in administrative positions. LaToya Carter, she's a track supervisor for Norfolk Southern. She does not go out and work on the track. She doesn't pound railroad spikes, but she's in charge of all the people who do go out and do the track repair on Norfolk Southern. This is a meeting of all the executive and office workers of Norfolk Southern at a gathering, I believe in Florida. So that's where they had their meetings, to give you an idea of the number of women working on the railroad. This is Caroline Decker. She's vice president for government affairs for Amtrak. And if you could see, that's the new Excella locomotive they have on the East Coast for Amtrak. So she's vice president of Amtrak, whatnot. This is Rebecca Pennington, and she's chief financial officer for the Federal Railroad Administration. In other words, she's in charge of all their accounting and all their money purchases and so forth. Chief financial officer, FRA. And this is Tamala Riggs, and she's the network administrator for the Federal Railroad Administration. You can see here the flag in the background of federal. These are official, public federal photographs. Next. This is Deb Miller. She's vice chair of the Surface Transportation Board. Surface Transportation Board has to do with railroad properties. The Federal Railroad Administration is in charge of railroad operations. This is in charge of properties, abandonments, additions, and so forth. So she's vice chair of the Surface Transportation Board. Ann Begeman, chair through several administrations of the Surface Transportation Board. In other words, she's in charge of the board. She's the chair of the board, Ann Begeman. And this is Corina Moore, president of Ontario Northern, and that's in Ontario, Canada. If you think of Toronto, just north of Toronto, okay? And it's a 500-mile, what they call regional railroad, mostly agriculture and forest wares and supplies. But she's a railroad president known for efficiency. I guess all the railroad presidents known for efficiency. That's the big thing today, to run efficiency. This is Iowa. We're back to Iowa. This is Melissa. She is in charge of the office, dispatcher, everything, train walker, everything for the Boone and Scenic Valley Railroad. If you ever run on a tourist line, the Boone and Scenic Valley Railroad, you'll probably talk to Melissa. She makes sure that you get on the train safely, and everybody's on the train. She says, "Okay, you can go." So she's like a dispatcher in a sense. Since Boone and Scenic Valley is actually a Class 3 railroad. I don't know whether she does the dispatching on there as a Class 3 or not, because that's a different level in licensing, because and Union Pacific runs in and out of there. So I think they do their own, I surmise they do their own dispatching. But that's our own Melissa, okay? And she does the same thing for the Kansas Bell dinner train. She does reservations, dispatching in a sense and so forth for the Kansas Bell. You can see the Kansas Bell logo here. Get here. And this is Sarah. She works on the Kansas Bell dinner train, and she makes sure that I have the best prime rib possible and an adult beverage from time to time. By the way, she has 10 children, and 4 of them work on the train. So she's in charge of everything, you know. Really, whatever Sarah says, that goes. That's it. So that's it. Okay. I know this is a lengthy program, and we went through the photos rather quickly and so forth. But actually, now my favorite part of the program is your comments and your questions and so forth. Yeah.
When you mentioned that the government made sure that if they had anything, any men or women had anything to do with the railroad, they were not brought into the draft for the gentleman for the war.
World War II. That was
Yeah.
World War II.
I was born in 36, same time my brother, oldest brother, moved to Pennsylvania. Him and my uncle set up a logging deal, and Bud had the sawmill. And from that point on, he was a real young guy, he was only like 23, 4. He ran the sawmill, and he had ties with the coal mines and the ties for the railroad, and that they told him, you don't go anywhere, you take care of that.
Right, right.
And that was in the... And do you have anything on the Pennsylvania horseshoe curve? Have you
Well,
looked at that?
yeah, not in this program, because this program is just women, but yes, and I've been on the horseshoe curve many times, by the way, on a train. And there is a park there. You can go there today at a park, and you can watch the trains go around. It was really an engineering marvel when they built it in the mid-1800s. So it was an engineering marvel. And I remember being on the train. If you're in the last car, you could see your front of your train, passenger train, going around the curve on the other side. It's really a marvel. No, not in this program, but I do talk about the horseshoe curve and other. I have about over 20 programs on railroads, so there's ample time. We get horseshoe curve in there. But yes, what they did with the draft simply was they said to the railroads, here, we need these many engineers or whatever, Gandhi dancers, and then what the railroad company do is ask for volunteers out of their men. If not, they would say, you're going in, you're going in. And it was dangerous work, too. Yeah. Someone else? Question, comment? Yes, ma'am.
My grandfather was a station agent here in Iowa and southern Minnesota. Would have been in 1910, 20, 30, along in there. He worked at the last station that he worked at, and my mother and her sisters and everybody lived in the second story of the depot.
Yes.
Was at
Yes.
Odison. And the depot is no more. They tore it down some number of years ago.
Right.
Would that have been the Rock Island line then that ran through like Odison, Fenton, Allendorf, up and through there?
Most likely, because we're talking with the gentleman here that the Rock Island had a center out of Esterville, Iowa, that went into Minnesota, and into South Dakota, most likely. And by the way, living in the second floor of the station for the station master was very common in 19th, early 20th century. Because someone had to be there all the time. Yeah. Yeah, very common that they would live that way. Yes. Very good. Someone else. This is my favorite part of the program. Yeah.
I have a question.
Sure.
So if the station master was sick, would the family take over then?
Yes. It was the whole family participated in that in the railroad work, and it was said that it's in your blood. That's what they would say. It's in your blood. The whole family got in there and worked on the railroad. It's difficult for us to imagine today, but when you're looking at from the post-Civil War period, okay, let's say post 1870, as the railroads were expanding west, transcontinental line, first one completed 1869. You have to understand that the railroad employed 20 million people by World War I. 20 million railroad workers. That was the largest non-agricultural industry in the United States. Nothing came close to it. And the depot, your station, was the center of life in your town, along with your church. And the reason for that was all your news came through the depot, the telegraph. All of your letters, mail, traveled by train, came through the depot. Anybody traveling in and out of town came through the depot because there were no roads. Also, there were no airplanes, but there were no roads. All the roads in the West, Midwest here, all the roads went from farm to the depot. The towns were not linked. You wanted to go from Spencer to Emmitsburg, you took the train because you couldn't get there by car. Before World War I, you could not travel by horse or by car on a road between Chicago and New York. Train. See, so the railroad station and railroad was really so much part of life on through the 1920s when you started to have cars. And then again during World War II, of course, we're talking about women working on the railroad in this program during World War II. But stop and think, during World War II, you were rationed 5 gallons of gasoline. Get this, your top speed, national speed limit was 35 miles an hour. Now tell me, where are you going to go with that? Huh? Then, if you could get gas and you could go 35 miles an hour, you couldn't get rubber for tires. So the only way that you got any place was bicycle, as long as your tires lasted. Roller skates, because at least you had steel wheels on your roller skates, and train. That was it. Actually, in World War II, over 90% of all transportation in the United States was by train. So you see, train again became the lifeblood of everything in the country. It was a whole mentality. If you go back at that time and you read newspaper articles, you read everything. Everything was railroad. Everything was train. The way we see today, everything is digital and computer. Back then, they saw by train and railroad. In fact, the whole point. Hey, you remember last weekend? Change from standard to daylight savings time and all. The time zones throughout the world were established by American railroads. Our whole sense of time was established by the railroad industry of the time zones. Railroads. Yeah, it was such a whole dominating part. Railroads bought more paper than any other thing in the United States up to the 19th, early 20th century. They bought more material, clothing material, than any other industry. Coal, iron ore, turned to steel, all to my road. So this was really, going back, the center of life, the center of one's mentality was the depot, was the train station, was the train. That brought to you the oranges from Florida. That brought to you the potatoes from Maine. That brought to you the meat. That brought to you everything came by rail, by train, everything. And the only way you went in and out of town was by train. So it's a different mentality than we have today. And that's why I say these women are working on the railroad, our theme for today is so very, very important to maintain that lifeline of the nation. That's what the railroads are called, lifeline of the nation, during World War I and during World War II. And these Molly pictures, if you will, helped keep that industry in our country going and helped us win 2 wars, 2 world wars. It was the United States that won World War I, United States that won World War II. Thank you to Molly Pitcher.
Yes, ma'am.
You spoke about the railroad passes that I suppose anybody on the railroad got to be able to travel on the train for free. Could you explain a little more about that particular thing?
Okay.
I remember my mother talked about they would ride the train from Addison and go out to Washington to see my grandfather's brother and his family, and they rode for free.
Yeah, I forgot. I have a railroad pass in my checkbook. It's in the other room. Yes, the passes worked on a graduation level. In other words, you could travel farther on a train on other railroads. The longer you worked for the railroad, that's the farther you could travel on a train. Mostly when you started out working, your first weeks on the railroad, you're starting out, you would get a pass that would take you from your home to wherever your work is on the railroad. You get a free ride. Then your family could travel within a distance on that railroad. And as you worked for the railroad, then your passes, if you will, longer rides. You travel on other railroad companies, except for ministers and priests. They got free passes right off for any railroad to travel, if you will, to travel back and forth for their ministry, ministries and whatnot. So they got free passes. But yeah, it worked that way. Kind of funny. I have a pass on the Pennsylvania Railroad issued in 1943 to a munitions inspector, because all trains carrying munitions had to have a munitions inspector on the train with the munitions. And I'll never forget one time I was traveling Amtrak, and I thought I would be funny. And the conductor came by, and I showed him my pass. And he looked at it. Okay. Excuse me, no. I got my real ticket here. I did. I was honest. I gave him my real ticket. But anyway, yeah, but the pass is that was good. And that was limited on the trains that individual could travel. For example, it could not travel on the Broadway Limited. It said no travel on Broadway Limited because there was no munitions, and that was their luxury train. So, and I have the telegraphers, by the way, even working for Western Union, 19th century could get train passes. Okay, and there were a couple of others that were attendant industries that were given passes years ago. I don't know how Amtrak does theirs now, because Amtrak is a government.
Digital.
Huh?
It's all digital.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm just saying, as far as I don't know what Amtrak regulations are.
Remember, and I don't know. Then we get on the train.
Oh, okay.
You make a reservation using the number.
When Amtrak took over, when the railroads sold passenger business to the government, which was Amtrak,
Right.
and the employees that on the railroads at that time held passes, they were granted passes then on Amtrak to accommodate that. So,
Okay.
it like you say, it is basically on your longevity, how many,
Right.
if you could ride on your home road or on other roads for a certain distance and that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah, I know, because there were certain obligations or something. For example, the Conrail conductors could work Amtrak trains or something, and then the ones from the CSX could work, but other conductors couldn't. And as I say, it's kind of but I don't know what it is today, whether they still grandfathered.
Airlines are the same way today. So if you're working for this United Airlines, maybe you could ride Pan Am, and maybe you can't.
Well, there's no longer an Eastern and no longer a Pan Am. I wouldn't want to ride them. They don't exist anymore.
But their successors would take over and grandfather those
Right, right. But I don't know if new workers today, I don't know what the new people would.
Yeah, the current employees, you had to work prior to 1971.
Yeah, right, when Amtrak was starting.
1971 is when they cut along, so if you hired out after 1971, you're not entitled to that.
Okay, and so you're saying that there's no passes on Amtrak at all?
Not after 1971.
1971,
you know.
okay. Oh, you mean the
grandfather
Right,
over, but
right.
Amtrak employees, currently ones, they're got passes.
okay. Someone else?
Well, you said that, cars were 35 miles. How fast did a train go back?
Oh, did you hear her said that the speed limit during World War II, that was a national speed limit, was 35 miles an hour. How fast did trains go?
Pullman had a car that they built in 1933 that exceeded 100 miles an hour.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Yes. Yes. Actually, most of them were certified for 120. 120. The Milwaukee Road train that came through here, okay, had a timetable speed through Wisconsin Dells at 116 miles an hour. Steam. Pennsylvania hit the plains of Indiana at 118. That's a timetable speed. Now, did they go faster? Yes. Because there were no speed limits on the railroad until 1947. That's when the federal government, through the Interstate Commerce Commission, stepped in. There was a bad accident on the Burlington Road outside of Chicago, and it was determined it was due to speed. So the federal government stepped in and started giving speed limits to trains. So the speed limits on trains are set by the Federal Railroad Administration and at times municipalities through which they pass through. Today, that's today. Okay, but back then during World War II, as fast as you want to go, you go. You open that throttle, get that steam in and out of those valves, and you go. There's some unofficial speed limits as high as 160 miles an hour. Those are unofficial. Unofficial. Then. Amtrak, of course, today has their Excella on the East Coast that goes 120 miles an hour over. And there's some straightaways that the FRA permits 90 miles an hour. On the old Santa Fe line has some straightaways, a couple other places. That is where just straight track and whatnot, so that they permit. But your speed limit's set today. But during World War II, in the 1920s and 1930s, when the government severely regulated the railroads competed by the speed between the two major cities they were going. So you went with the fastest railroad. Get there the faster. Famous race was between the Broadway Limited and the 20th Century Limited. They would leave Chicago, New York at exactly the same second and race to the other city. And who got there? It was competition, who got there first. And there are a couple others that are like that. So they had competed by speed, and the other way they competed was in the dining car, what their feature meal was. Yes. So you could actually go to New York and Chicago by 6 different railroads depending upon what you wanted for dinner. And it was so incredible that people actually had their favorite chefs on the railroad. And the chefs made their own seasonings. They all did that themselves and whatnot. And they cooked all the food with wood-burning fires. So they competed with food, they competed with speed, they competed with your nurses on the train, hostesses. Hey, more comfort on Northern Pacific. No, I'm going to take Union Pacific, whatnot. So that reminds me of the old joke. Around 1900, remember Emily Post? Come on, remember Emily Post? They asked Emily Post, what is the best road in the United States? Emily Post, without stopping or anything, said, oh, Union Pacific. Because road meant railroad. Remember back in our mentality, we said before, right, trains, huh? Okay. Good question, good
You
question.
talk about women on the rail. Do you have any information on women that were hobos or?
Yes, but they didn't work for the railroad, okay? No. Railroads don't like hobos. Yes, there is one, I would say, almost legendary female hobo, and her name was Boxcar Bertha.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Boxcar Bertha. But there's very little, you could say, historic material, meaning that you can say is factually based other than someone repeating a legend. And it seemingly, Boxcar Bertha was in several places at the same time. Yeah. So, but there was a Boxcar Bertha, or that is, people spoke of Boxcar Bertha, but there really isn't any, let's say, historical biographical information to pinpoint about her. And of course, the whole thing of hobos on the rail is a whole, well, see, you're talking to me about post office and dining cars and all that. Those are other programs that I do. So you got to be careful. I'll get going. Too much. Yeah, but very good. Yeah, the hobos. By the way, during World War II, hobos did not ride the railroads. They worked in defense plants. Everybody had to do their bit, and there were no longer any hobos. They all worked in defense plants. Everybody had to do their share. So they said, no, we're going to do it. And by the way, don't think of as a hobo as somebody totally down and out and somebody who has no money. There are records of MDs and lawyers that became hobos. They just liked that lifestyle for a while. In fact, there was a whole Hobo University, and that's what it was called, the Hobo University, out of Chicago around 1900. Believe it or not. And they had a debate team. They had a debate team, and they actually beat the students at the University of Chicago. They actually won. Yep. So, yeah, hobo thing is really something else. Yeah. Great comment, great questions. Really great questions. Yes, ma'am.
When I rode the Empire Builder out of Minneapolis out to Washington, I know we had to stop several times, and freights had the right of way. Is that a common occurrence nowadays?
Yeah, freights have the right of way. Wow, you're getting on a very sore subject with Amtrak. Okay. Ooh, yeah, I know. Woo. Okay, here's the deal. Okay, supposedly Amtrak has a window, a time window, that they are allotted on the railroads, nation's railroads, and if they maintain that time window, then they supposedly have priority. If they miss that time window, then they can be held up, okay? If they are in that time window and a freight holds them up, there's a fine that the railroad has to pay. But the railroads make so much money with moving the freight that the fines are negligible. And this running on time, which was so incredible with railroads in years past during World War II, when running on time was so important. The conductor with the pocket watch and, running on time, because that way you prevent accidents when you run on time. Today with Amtrak, it's a real problem with them because it's like it's a battle between them and the freight railroads. It leads to lawyers arguing. You raise a very good question, and some people say that if the trains ran more on time, then Amtrak would attract more passengers. Now on the East Coast, between Boston and Washington, D.C., Amtrak owns the track. They are the railroad company, and they can determine that their trains leave on time and they have priority over freight that runs those routes. But outside of that, it's when railroads gave up their May of 1971 is when Amtrak went into being, and when that happened, the deal was that the Amtrak was going to take over all the passenger business, and the railroads were happy to give up the passenger business. They were losing money. But the idea was that the freight railroads were to help maintain and keep the trains on time and so forth. And they haven't, and that's a really sore point. By the way, you know what Amtrak's original name was? Rail Packs. And they thought we better not use Rail Packs because it sounds more like Rail Pox. So, yeah, I know. So they said, we'll call it something else, and that's what they call National Rail Passenger Corporation, normally just called Amtrak. Okay, but good question, good point, and it's a sore point today, yeah. But Amtrak wants to run in their window. I think we're getting a signal here, right? We're getting a signal. Okay, maybe say one more question or one more comment, and we can go. One more. Going. One more.
Don't mess with the librarian.
Going. All aboard, train number 4. Train number 4 leaving Canton to Points East. Special parlor car for the Spencer Library. Say thank you very much. Thank you.